James Scott sat in the library of a luxurious mansion, surrounded by old books and a dusty scent that seemed to carry the weight of the place's history. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had reached a dead end. He was 23 years old, and he had already known poverty, rejection, and false promises. But now he found himself in another world, a world where everything was easy, where money solved everything. This world was his new opportunity, but also his most terrible trap. He grew up in a poor neighborhood, in a family that never had enough money for the basic necessities. All he had was tenacity and determination to escape poverty. He knew that education, career, and business success were his only chance for salvation. And so, a few years later, he found himself here, in this luxurious estate, which was the result of his efforts and ambitions. However, anxiety grew in his soul with each passing day. He could not forget how, several years ago, his life changed when he met Alexander. Then they were just partners, and now Alexander became his enemy. It seemed like everything started with a promising startup, but Alexander betrayed him, taking away everything that James had worked so hard to build. "You can't be like those people," his father had once told him. But now he realized that he had become one of them. The trap he had fallen into was not simply the result of his decisions, but the consequence of allowing himself to follow a path of betrayal in the name of success. James closed his eyes and thought about how his life was going downhill. Alexander had taken advantage of his trust, drawn him into his own schemes, and now it seemed he was going to squeeze everything he could out of it. The last time they had met, in a restaurant, Alexander had said with cold certainty that James had no choice. He was completely controlled. Now, James understood that Alexander was not just his partner, but his shadow, his antagonist, who was destroying everything he once considered right. "You can't take back what you've already lost," Alexander told him that evening. "You're just a pawn in my game, and if you want to survive, you'll have to play by my rules." But James wasn't going to give up. He was willing to fight, despite his insecurities and inner torments. He knew he couldn't just give in and let Alexander win. There was too much in his life worth preserving, and he couldn't let it all fall apart. Now he faced the most important choice. Was there still room for honor and principles in his world of manipulation and lies? Or would he have to become who Alexander wanted him to be and go down his path, playing his game? This time, James decided he would act, not for revenge, but for his own salvation. He couldn't allow himself to be another victim of this cruel game. But how can you fight a man who knows your weaknesses, uses them against you? At that moment, his thoughts were interrupted by a quiet shadow in the doorway. It was Lily. She was one of the few who had ever supported him, who saw in him more than just an ambitious young man looking for a way out of poverty. Lily was his friend, and he knew that she would never betray him. "James, you're preoccupied," she said quietly as she entered the library. "What are you so busy with?" James looked at her and felt relief, but also more anxiety. He couldn't hide from her that everything in his life was not as it should be. "Lily, I need to talk to you," he replied, inviting her to sit down. "There are things I can no longer hide." Lily sat down across from James, her gaze filled with worry. She had always been there for him, but lately she felt like there was an unspeakable distance between them. James seemed preoccupied with something more than just his business. She could see how his eyes, once so hopeful, now hid something dark that he couldn't or wouldn't show. "James, you've become so different," she said, cursing herself for the words but unable to stop them. "You were always strong, but you weren't like this. You weren't the guy who fought for more than money anymore. You were part of the system that swallowed you up. James felt the weight of her words settle on his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that he couldn't find the words. He wasn't sure who he had become anymore, or how he had allowed himself to change so much. He was on the brink of losing everything that had ever meant more to him. "Lily, you don't understand," he said, leaning forward as if he were trying to convince not just her, but himself. "This isn't just business. This isn't just money. This is all I have. You don't know what it's like to start from scratch, to be at rock bottom, and know you can't get out. You don't understand what it's like to be told you can never be someone important unless you play by their rules." Lily was silent, but there was pain in her eyes. She had always supported him, believed in his abilities, but now she saw how he was losing himself. Her heart sank at the thought that she could have done something to help him, but now it was too late. "You don't want to be like this, James," she whispered. "You don't want to be part of this game. You can choose another way. You always could. You still can." But James already knew that the choice had been made. He could not go back. With each passing day, he was falling deeper into a world of manipulation and intrigue where there was no place for the weak. Alexander, his former partner, now his enemy, was the man who held him hostage. He knew all his weaknesses, all his fears, and now he was using them against him. That evening, James was alone in his office, once again immersed in papers, contracts, and financial reports. But something inside him was still seething, like an unopened wound. He thought about what Lily had said. He knew she was right, but what could he do? How could he get out of this game when his life was already inextricably tied to hers? His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. He looked at the screen. It was Alexander's number. "James," said the cold voice on the other end of the line, "you know perfectly well that you can't walk away from our case. You've come too far to back out, and if you don't sign the contract, you'll lose everything, including what you have left." James felt the blood drain from his face. This was what he had been afraid of. Alexander knew how to approach him, how to manipulate him. He was on the edge of abandoning all his ideals and entering into the game Alexander had for him. But James knew that if he agreed, it would be the end. He would lose himself, lose his soul. "You don't understand, Alexander," James said, trying to remain calm. "I can't be a part of this anymore. I won't play by your rules." Alexander's response was icy. "You have no choice, James. You are just a pawn, and you must remember that in this game, we are all pawns." He hung up. James knew Alexander didn't need to say more. He knew that every move he made in this game was already predictable. He couldn't take it all back, but he also knew that his life couldn't be in Alexander's hands. James rose from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark silhouette of a city so far from what he had once called home. He knew his fight was just beginning. But now, his war was not only with Alexander, but with himself. He had to decide who he was, a man willing to give up everything to succeed, or one willing to risk everything to reclaim his soul. A few days had passed since his conversation with Alexander, and James felt the tension growing inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life depended on one wrong move. Every day, every moment was filled with this fear. The fear that he would lose everything he had worked so hard to build. He found himself back in the luxurious manor, which seemed so far removed from the world he had grown up in. The golden clocks on the walls, the tapestries covered with dust from time, and the ever-shining windows overlooking the endless garden. All of this was a reminder of what he had achieved. But inside, he felt empty. The manor was beautiful, but it had become a cage in which he was locked. Lily was there, as always. She didn't ask too many questions, but she always supported him, was his anchor in this world full of lies and manipulations. However, even her presence couldn't lift the weight that James felt in his soul. He felt her gaze full of concern, and he realized that he could no longer hide his pain. "Will you tell me what's going on?" Lily asked one morning when they met in the garden. "You can't keep everything to yourself, James. You can't do that." Her words cut him like the tip of a knife, but he knew she was right. He couldn't continue living in the shadow of his secrets. "Lily, I don't know what to do," he admitted, looking down. "Alexander, he controls everything. He knows all my weaknesses and uses them against me, and I can't stop it." Lily stood next to him, her voice full of determination. "But you can, James. You can make a choice. You don't have to give in to his manipulation. You deserve more." His inner voice was torn with doubt. He knew Lily was right, but the fear of losing everything he had built was stronger. He couldn't just throw away everything he had built over the last few years. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget how ruthlessly Alexander had acted, how he had betrayed him when James needed him most. But Lily couldn't understand the depth of what was at stake. She didn't know what it was like to lose everything you'd ever dreamed of and end up at rock bottom. And despite her support, James knew she couldn't save him unless he took the plunge. He made up his mind. "I'll fight, Lily," he said, raising his head. "I'm not going to just give in. If I have to lose everything, I'll do it with dignity." There was a fire of determination in his eyes, and Lily realized that this was more than just a promise. He was willing to risk everything to escape a game that seemed to have no winners. And if Alexander was the one who had trapped him in this, then James was ready to face him now. Meanwhile, Alexander did not stop his manipulations. He began to do everything to make James feel that he had no way out. Phone calls, meetings, threats, all this became part of the daily routine. James knew that Alexander wanted something more than just his submission. He was ready to sacrifice everything in order to gain control. But now James was ready to act too. The day Alexander invited him to his final meeting, James knew it would be a defining moment. He picked up the contract that could finally end his life and signed it without hesitation. But the moment he handed the document to Alexander, his eyes filled with determination. "You thought I would be your pawn, Alexander?" James said with cold confidence in his voice. "You were wrong." Alexander looked up, and a slight smile appeared on his face. He had not expected such a reaction. "You can't beat me, James. You're too deep in this." "You're wrong," James replied, feeling his strength return. "I'm going to fight, and I'm not going to play by your rules." Several weeks had passed since the contract had been signed, and James felt no relief. On the contrary, he felt his life sinking deeper into the fog of doubt and inner struggle. He tried to hide from Lily that his path had become neither easier nor clearer. Every step, every moment in this estate was like a prison, in which his whole being yearned for freedom. But was he ready to sacrifice everything for this freedom? He was not sure. The day he had last met Alexander still loomed before him like an unspeakable threat. He hadn't known that his actions would lead to this, but he now understood that everything he had achieved was just part of a larger game. A game he couldn't simply win. It was either won or lost, and there was no telling which was worse. One evening, as clouds gathered on the horizon and the wind whistled through the gardens, James found himself in the darkened library of the estate. He sat at the old desk, turning the pages of legal documents, but his thoughts were far from these words. He remembered his youth. The days when his only goal was to survive, to escape poverty, to become someone he could be proud of. He remembered the moment he first met Alexander. It was the moment he thought he had finally found a partner who would help him fly. But Alexander, as it turned out, was not a friend, but a manipulator, a skilled player who was always in control of the situation. Now James was faced with a dilemma. He could continue working with Alexander, signing contracts, running the business, but lose himself in the process. He could leave and try to get his life back, but what was left for him? His family did not support his choice. Lily was the only person who believed in him, but even she could not replace his own ambitions. As often happens, the solution came at the moment of greatest crisis. "James, you have a choice," Alexander said that evening when they met in his office. He spoke quietly but confidently. "Either you play by my rules or you leave. But if you leave, everything you've built will crumble. You'll be left empty-handed, with empty ideas." James wasn't ready to give in. He took a deep breath, feeling his inner walls begin to crumble. But then he looked into Alexander's eyes. "I'm not afraid of losing everything, Alexander. I'm afraid of losing myself," he said, feeling his heart beat faster. "I'm going to quit this game, and I'm going to fight for my freedom, no matter what you think." Alexander's answer was quiet, but heavy, like a sentence. "Do you think you've won? You don't yet understand that your decision is the beginning of your destruction, James." With that, he stood up and walked away, leaving James alone with his thoughts. Everything he had built seemed so fragile. He knew that at some point he would have to pay a price for his resolve. But now that he had made his decision, he couldn't go back. 3 weeks later, James found himself at a threshold he could not avoid. Alexander had kept his promise. He had begun to destroy everything James had built, breaking contracts, ruining deals, filling his world with chaos. James knew his decision to become independent had been a disaster. But now he knew he could not back out. He found himself back in that luxurious mansion, but it was no longer his home. He felt like a stranger within its walls, as if for all these years he had lived under the illusion that he was in control of his life. But now he realized that the game was too big for him. Lily came that evening when he was sitting at his desk, tired from the many failures and attempts to cope with the disaster unfolding in his life. "You knew it would be like this, James. You knew it wasn't just a game," she said, coming up to him. Her voice was soft, but firm. "Why would you give up everything for this? For a fight that might already be lost?" James looked up, and her words were like the tip of a knife. He saw in her eyes not condemnation, but regret. "I couldn't continue to be a part of this. I couldn't continue to live a lie, Lily," he replied, his voice shaking with the tension within him. "I wasn't ready to become what I hated, and now I've lost everything." Lily was silent, her gaze full of pain and understanding. She walked up to him and took his hand. "I can't give you what you want, James, but I'll be there. You're not alone." This was a turning point for James. He knew his fight was not over. He knew he had to find a new path, perhaps one different from the one he had been pursuing so doggedly for all these years. But one thing was clear. He was not ready to give up. James sat in his office, staring at his cold coffee, which had long since lost all meaning. He knew that his time on this path was coming to an end, and this moment was inevitable. Many thoughts were spinning in his head, but one remained constant. He had to meet Alexander again, and this conversation would be decisive. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes, trying to find some peace within himself. Lily had left a few hours ago, leaving him with his demons. He knew that her support was all he had left, but now he had to decide for himself what to do with what he had created and destroyed over the past few months. When James finally stood up and headed for the door, his resolve was unwavering. He knew he couldn't just be a passive participant in this game any longer. He was going to take action. And even if it meant his downfall, he had to try. He'd come into this world with one goal in mind: to survive. And now, despite all the odds, he was deciding how he was going to live his life. The meeting with Alexander took place in one of the most luxurious rooms of the estate, where everything was carefully planned and idealized, like Alexander's life itself. James walked inside, feeling the cold air seem even heavier. He stood in front of Alexander, who was already waiting for him. "You've come again," Alexander said with a grin, his voice full of calm confidence. "What do you want now, James? You knew it would be like this." "I came to end this," James said, keeping his voice steady. "I won't be your puppet anymore. You thought I was afraid of losing everything, but I'm really afraid of losing myself. You destroyed everything I built, and now I'm destroying this game." Alexander raised an eyebrow, as if he didn't understand what James was saying. "You think you can beat me? You don't understand, James. No one wins in this game. You're either broken or you've broken." James couldn't stand still any longer. He took a step forward, his eyes burning with fury and determination. "I will break your game, and I will start by taking back what you stole from me. I will take back my freedom, and I will not have to fight for it anymore." At that moment, the air in the room became heavy, as if the atmosphere itself sensed the tension between them. Alexander looked calm, but there was a flicker of worry in his eyes. "You don't understand what you're losing, James. You want to destroy everything I've built? You don't even know what you're dealing with." "You didn't build this, I did," James said, stepping closer. "You used my ambitions, my desires, to strengthen your power. But now I'm taking my power back." Alexander paused, as if thinking, and then suddenly laughed. "Do you think your fight will end if you say these words? You are wrong. I have everything I need to destroy you. And you know it." James gritted his teeth, but his eyes were full of determination. "I'm not leaving without beating you, Alexander," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not giving in. You don't even know what I'm willing to lose to regain control of my life." And at that moment, when it seemed that the conversation could turn into a physical confrontation, Alexander stood up and walked over to the table. He picked up the documents that were lying on his desk and handed them to James. "I'll give you everything you want, James," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "But remember one thing. If you decide to come back, the game will continue. I won't give up. You won't be able to defeat me, even if you win this battle." James stood looking at the documents that symbolized everything Alexander had taken from him. He knew it was a trap. He had heard these threats many times before and knew that if he took this step, it would all be over. But at the same time, his inner voice told him that he had no other choice. He decided, "I'm not coming back," he said, folding the papers in half and throwing them in the trash. "The game is over. Now it's your turn to lose everything you so desperately want to keep." Alexander fell silent. There was a flash of displeasure in his eyes, but also respect. He knew that James was not a man to be easily manipulated. "Do you believe that you will be free, James? You have simply taken on a debt that I will never leave you alone." "I am free," James replied with determination, "and I will fight to keep that freedom." At that moment, James realized that this was only the beginning of his journey. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing. He was no longer a player on someone else's side. After his encounter with Alexander, James felt his body fill with a heavy yet liberating feeling. He was no longer just a pawn in someone else's game. He was in control of his actions. But this victory was emptier than he had expected. All that he had lost, all the crumbling bridges, gave him no joy. His life was now in his hands. But what about what was left in the past? He returned to his small office. Now that the decision had been made and the enemy had been defeated, the world seemed to have grown quieter and stiller. But in that silence, he felt his own heart continue to beat wildly, filled with fear of the unknown future. Lily called him late in the evening. "James, you know that I will always be there for you. You are not alone." Her voice was soft, supportive. He smiled, although he himself did not know what his new path was. "I know, Lily, but I need time to figure out what to do next. This isn't just the end for Alexander, it's the end for me." She fell silent, apparently feeling the full weight of his words. She had always been there, but now that he was free, he had to learn to live with it. "You deserve to be happy," she said, and this time her words sounded like a promise she was ready to fulfill, even if James himself did not yet understand how to do it. A day later, James sat at his desk, his eyes falling on the papers he had thrown away. They were the last link to his past, but now his past had no power over him. He began to plan his life without it. He knew it would be a long road, and that he had more to lose than he thought. But his resolve was strong. He built a team for his first serious business, from scratch. He didn't want to be a victim or a puppet. He wanted to build something of his own, based on honesty, perseverance, and the hardships he had gone through. He knew the world would not forgive his mistakes, but now he was ready for the sacrifices he had to make to become strong again. Months passed, and James became more and more involved in his new project. Lily stayed by his side, supporting him, but he became more and more distant. He wasn't ready to open his soul, even if she still believed in him. He knew that it would take time to process everything he had been through. And in those lonely moments, he learned to appreciate what he had. He couldn't just go back to his old life, but he could build a new one. On the day he signed his first contracts, he suddenly realized that maybe this victory wasn't a real victory. He still felt empty inside despite his successes, but now he had a chance to fix it. And maybe his journey would never end, because, like all life, it would always be filled with choices.